Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the June 21st Chicagoland SharePoint Users Group session. I'm Mark Boat, the chairperson, and today I'll be co-presenting with Ralph Rivas from Magenic Software. Welcome and thanks for coming. We've got a number of interesting topics to cover in today's session that were broadcast on LinkedIn and on the Meetup website. Let's just jump right in. Our agenda is covering big picture stuff, understanding SharePoint's purpose. We're going to introduce a new topic today called Open Mic, where we're going to open the floor up for any questions, tips, lessons learned, things like that from members. We have heard from people, and I know that there are people out there that may want to share some stuff with us. We'll also talk about recent news and upcoming events, and then cool new stuff by both Ralph today and myself. So let's jump in. Big picture stuff. We like to continue reiterating to new and old members alike that SharePoint is part of a collaboration technology, and there are four main stages to collaboration maturity. There's communicating, there's sharing, there's tasking, and there's tracking. The two biggest ones for most organizations, fledgling ones, are communicating and sharing, for which there's a number of different technologies. But when you get into tasking, actually dealing in the currency of tasks, passing not messages about tasks, but actual tasks back and forth, and then begin tracking not only tasks, but every other thing related to a collaborative endeavor, SharePoint really comes to the forefront and starts to help you move up into that third stage and into that fourth stage. Keep that in mind. The big tagline on the slide is, understand where your organization is, and then you aim for the next level without trying to leapfrog. This is going to become particularly relevant in my own presentation today, where we're going to talk about ITAR compliance. And ITAR really comes down to communicating and sharing of information that's going to be regulated by the government, which is why I wanted to show this slide today. Moving on, we're going to try this new topic, open mic. We're going to see where this goes with us, with our limitations on technology, things like this. But it's an invitation for members to share questions, tips, tricks, things like that. Specifically, we had one person mention a few weeks ago that they were recently coming across some lessons learned related to content type naming conventions, what you call the internal names, what you call the external names, the tips. Let's spend a few minutes and see. Jay, are you out there today? Is there something that you'd like to share with the group about things that you've learned related to content type naming conventions? And Erica, I'm going to ask you to see if you can open up the mic for everybody, and we're going to see what happens. I see Alexis, Cindy, James, Jeff. Jay, are you on today? Or is there anything else? Any other people in the group? Anything that someone has learned that you'd like to take over the mic? We'll temporarily mute everyone else so you have a moment to share something that you've learned about SharePoint. Can we try to open up the mics, Erica or Edie? I still see everybody listed as mute, but feel free to try to chat or use the question tool to ask any questions and see if there's something that you want to share with the group. I don't see Jay on, the person that, yes.
Oh, I started to unmute people, but there was a lot of background noise. So maybe if people do want to talk, they could like chat us or send us a message and then we can unmute them.
Yeah, let's try that. I don't see Jay on. I don't see anybody using the chat tool to volunteer. But if you do suddenly feel the urge to share something, please use the chat tool to send us a little note that said, I'd like to talk for 2 minutes on this particular topic. And we'll find a way to squeeze that in. But at least you know, as a team, as a group, as a user group, we're trying to make room for you to share such things on a monthly basis with all of us. Let's move on to the next slide. It's your typical news and events, keeping things on your radar. In very late May, Microsoft announced that they are now going to be offering something like GDPR compliance features. This is data protection on the European Union. You can find a link to that. This is starting to be a big deal. Data protection on the Europe side, even on the US side in the form of ITAR, It's becoming more and more prevalent. Dates are being set, and more importantly, violations are actually going to be called on people, and there are going to be potentially consequences involved. In early June, Skype got a facelift. Also in June, Microsoft announces the SharePoint framework extensions, and our guest speaker, Ralph Rivas, is going to be talking about that later. Also related to SPFX is that it hit version 1.1.1, and while that sounds innocuous, Ralph is going to clue us in that it is yet again a very significant change. Also in June this month, Apple announces that iOS support for OneDrive, which means even Apple is finally acknowledging that OneDrive is a very big player in this space. Also in June, Microsoft silently, and this is odd, announces a new product, Microsoft Forms. Not really new, it's been around for at least a year in the education sector, but now it's becoming generally available. It's a tool used for building polls, questionnaires, surveys, and that sort of thing. Mark Me is wondering if this might be a tentative replacement for InfoPath. We'll just have to see, because even as of June 2017, InfoPath is still seriously dead. They want it gone and they want it replaced, but they haven't given us anything. Looking ahead to the future, we've got September and November. Ignite is coming up in Orlando, Florida. And in November, we got SP TechCon in Washington, D.C. You'll see links there that you can get from the downloaded slide deck later on. That should clue us in on news and events in the area. Cool new stuff that we're going to cover is Ralph Rivas is going to talk on SPF extensions. Later, as time permits, I'll talk about ITAR compliance. And I think we're going to use that as our segue point. I'd like to introduce Ralph Rivas from Agenic. He's going to be doing a talk and presenting what are some demo materials on SPF extensions. Ralph, here I go to add and make you the presenter.
All righty, show my screen just a moment here. Let me get a clean monitor. And just let me know that you guys can see at least a few windows, especially the starting point for learning about the framework extensions from the mouth of the horse itself, Microsoft. You guys in?
Looks good, Ralph.
Are we all in? Okay, so here's the thing about dev topics, right? Dev topics can literally take hours, or for that matter, days. I mean, they have whole trade shows all about it. So one of the things that happened last time when we were trying to do like demos and everything else, so we were trying to get in the weeds a little bit. I'm trying to avoid that. If you guys want to get in the weeds, that's what the meetup is for. Go talk to us over there, or talk to anyone else, attend the forums, go to the tech community, everything else, and get us into the weeds. Maybe outside of these particular cases. Over here, I think we should like try to keep things as overviewish as possible. I'll give a few tips and tricks perhaps and everything like that, but just so you know, you're not going to be expecting to see a piece of code over here that you're going to come out and get in GitHub, mainly because if I just showed it and not explained it, it would not be a good idea. So that being said, the SharePoint framework extensions, what is it? This is probably what a lot of people want to know. It's like, well, we know why we had to have the framework. We had to have a development model that essentially was better than what we had before. With essentially the provider-hosted apps was the attempt to make that better, essentially the attempt to open it up, but it still had some major limitations. Essentially what they did was now that they're on the web, they essentially were able to do whatever they could to make use of all the technologies that take any kind of web developer and turn them into a SharePoint developer, and vice versa. That's what a lot of this is all about. The SharePoint framework extensions, what the concept was, there were so many things you couldn't do before. If you attended the last session, we showed you the concept of the workbench. The workbench was this sort of like pseudo a SharePoint site that you could call up, and it pretty much acted like a modern page in the SharePoint Online situation, and it allowed you to do testing and everything else. Well, guess what? We don't have that for the SharePoint framework extensions. These only work if you have a tenant. And to get a tenant, it's not hard. It's pretty cheap. You can get a trial for a month, for example. But otherwise, the cheapest tenant that you can get, which is a dev tenant from office.microsoft.com, will cost you like $10 a month. And if you're in development mode, if you're doing this for your business or anything else, it behooves you to have one. $10 is not really that much to spend, but it maybe find a way to leverage it. That's all I can say. And you'll have to have it anyway in order to complete, as they say, your training. Essentially, you want to be a Jedi. You want the lightsaber, but you're getting only the hilt. It won't even light up. You need to be able to make it light up. All right. So the extensions. Let's look at what this is about. take a look over here. I have over here, we're going to post these links over here later on, but we can actually post them online. dev.office.com/sharepoint/docs/spfx/extension/overview-extensions. Long enough name. There's probably an AKA for it, but the concept over here is it explains what the program is about. This is in dev mode now. This is not what's called released. That means that this will only work on our dev instances, for example. We can't give this to say, clients. We can't give this to regular businesses yet. They're still working on it. This is the way the SharePoint framework was for quite a while. They want to make sure that they get this right before they get it out there. But there's three things that are involved here, which you couldn't do before. One, the concept of the application customizer. We used to have something called JS Link, where you could basically write a piece of JavaScript, deploy it to good old SharePoint, and whatever that JavaScript did will just happen to maybe the entire site or any place else that you wanted to. Maybe you used to mess with a custom master page and do that sort of stuff before. Well, when you're on SharePoint Online, doing stuff like that is pretty much not good. They don't like it. You're messing with their stuff, and you're potentially adding security holes into their bits. So they basically closed that ability down and left it only for the older systems. So they had to make an ability because it's still needed. We still need to be able to do that. We still need to be able to make our own menus, our own graphics ways of doing things, and that's the concept of the application customizer, which is this first item over here. You can add script to a page, access well-known HTML placeholders, and essentially extend them with custom renderings. That's exactly what it says, exactly what it is. The other one, of course, is the fields. We used to like mess around with fields. I know you guys remember playing with Camel. Yes, we used to walk a mile for that Camel, actually more like 10 miles, because that was hard work to be able to work with the Camel code. You had to have your XML, XSL skills up to speed to be able to make changes. And when you made these changes, you were talking feature stapling potentially, or doing things that essentially were, let's just say when they messed up in a royal way against SharePoint. Well, now you can do that with the SharePoint extensions, and you can do it quite cleanly and quite safely, actually. And the next one was command sets. And you remember you used to have that right-click ability? Remember you used to be able to go right-click on a SharePoint site, and then you would get like the links of the things you can do. You were able to add stuff to that and remove stuff to that. That was also a way of the functions. Well, they had to have that because it went away almost when they went to SharePoint Online in the modern pages. So they brought it back, and there it is, the command sets. So they explain over here how to get it started. If you guys were here at the last time, what we did we brought in for the install the generators. You're gonna basically have to call this generator again. Do another npm command to just call it back, and it's going to give you a new version of it. And I'm going to show you how that's looking. Before I proceed, are there any questions that are hitting the screen? I'm looking at the chat and I don't see anything yet, but maybe there's a question happening somewhere else. Going once, going twice.
So far,
okay.
so good. Yeah.
All right. So, of course, there's a link to building your first Hello World extension, which is not exactly Hello World. It's pretty easy to follow and everything else. But what's very interesting is it describes what has changed. And let me show you quickly in person what has changed. So I'm going to do my good old yo, and I'm going to do something slightly different than the way Microsoft presents it. And I'm going to include my tips and tricks. So we basically use Yeoman, right? And we basically say we can just use Yeoman by itself and we can just go. But this is what I do. I do yo at Microsoft/SharePoint. But I always add this --skip-install. All right. And the reason why I do this is I don't want to wait a million years for all the bits to load up, because not only is it basically building the scaffold, but it's getting all the pieces, leaving the links, creating all the pieces that need to happen for it in order for it to run. All right, which we don't need at this point. I also use a different tool for that, and I'll show you that in just a second. All right, so I'm going to do the, oh, wait a minute. Here's another major change that happened with the extensions. When they brought the extensions, that good old SPFX 1.1.1, did it change? Yes. Maybe you saw my video, maybe you saw other people's videos on how this stuff worked. Well, now I actually have to, ahead of time, make a directory where I want this to work. Let's see, Spug. All right, and so I'm going to make a directory there. Now I have to actually change to that directory. All right, and now I run my little yo command. Because remember that feature that said, oh, you get to say if it's going to be local or you can make a subdirectory with that name? They took it away. Not exactly sure when that happened. I don't know who said that it was that they hated it, but somebody apparently hated it enough that they took it out. So I have Microsoft slash.
That might make people mad, isn't it? Everybody's gonna get a rude awakening the first time they overwrite the directory that they thought they were gonna get a subdirectory in.
So that's exactly what happened to me when I wrote it. I'm like, hey, where did my directory go? I'm like, ls, not there, not there, not there. Okay, stand by. All right, now it's asking for the solution name, which is, it picks the name of the directory you're in. That's fine with me. All right, aha, and now here's the first change. Now we have a choice of web part or extension. All right, and you'll see that it says preview right over there. It's very clear. So we can still do the traditional web part piece. There's some very, very, very minor changes to that, other than the fact that that change that I told you about, where it doesn't give you a directory to choose from anymore. All right, so I'm going to, yes, go ahead.
You didn't add that -- skip extension, your suffix on the end of your command.
Right, very good, thank you. Control Z. Thank you, Control C, and I'm out of it. Great. Let's do that again. -- skip -- install. Here we go. One more time. Here we go. Yes, we'll say yes to that. We're going to do an extension. And let me show you. Now we have the 3 different extensions: Application Customizer, Field Customizer, and List View Command Set. List View Command Set's what we were talking about, those command sets. Essentially, if you're in a list and you're right-clicking on an item on the list, you want to create a custom command. That's what that is. All right, so for now, we're going to do, let's see, what's a good one to do? Sort of doesn't matter over here. Maybe the application customizer, perhaps. Okay, actually, for now, it doesn't quite matter. So I'm going to do the application customizer. All right, so it's asking what's the name of the app. Hello world. I'm going to keep the name. Description, I can say something, whatever I want over here. Notice what it's, okay, look, boom, it's pretty much there. I have all the pieces ready to play. But you notice what it didn't ask for. It didn't ask for a framework. It didn't say React. It didn't say Knockout or JS, just regular JavaScript. Because in this particular case, it's very straightforward for those pieces. Now, that doesn't mean that there's not an ability to work with React and everything else. Essentially, what they did was they didn't want to tie it down to a framework. They wanted to give you literally the barest of bare bones with that. That might change on release. All right. And now, this is what I do, by the way, to make sure that it gets faster. So I'm just going to do a program called Yarn, where I got from yarnpkg.org. So I do a Yarn install, and I do a ignore platform because there's a bug in it. And that's how I get it to get going. So I'm just going to let that run for now. And that's what it's doing. It's essentially packaging all the pieces. But let's go and pretend that we did run it. And we ran it, and I did a code dot, the Visual Studio fast way of getting in. So let me show you what this app now looks like. Let's take a look at some important pieces for an extension. An extension has one giant, very, very major piece, and that's this. In the manifest JSON located in the source directory, and by the way, you have to make sure you do this build here, otherwise some of this stuff may not work. In the source directory, you have over here an ID. This ID is very critical because it's the only way. Oh, Control Z. It's the only way you're going to be able to actually debug the system. And by the way, like as I said, you can only debug online, and I'll show that in a moment. The alias over here, you can make a new alias on it, but usually don't recommend changing that. But everything else, if you want, there's no real guidance on modifying that at the moment. So give it a moment. All right, so that's key. First thing you're probably going to want to do is just copy paste that guy into good old Notepad somewhere where you can use it. All right, let's look at the main file. So just like as you notice, it's set up just like the regular web part structure before. So here's our main page over here. And this is now the next most important part. There are, besides the fact that it's importing these very specific pieces to bring in the framework extensions, there's 2 important pieces: on init and on render. These 2 particular pieces of command. The first one, on init, is stuff to do before it starts up. So whatever you want it to do, load up artifacts, maybe pre-compile something, or load up things ahead of time so that you're fast loading, things like that. That's where it would happen. On render is where essentially the magic comes, and you can see this is why there's no framework here. All this is literally is it's taking from the debugger a property called a message, called test message, and I'll show you that in a bit, and essentially sticking it in somewhere. And essentially the only way you'll ever see this is in a debug console. They're not actually displaying anything on the screen at all or anything like that. All right, that's what this is. And of course, there's all it is just sending a message that's with an alert with that exact same information. That's all there is. That's nothing else happening over here. All right, so it's finished. By the way, that thing finished over here. So what do we have over here? So we have now the fact that we have this piece, and basically when we run it, and where is the other window? One moment, please. Let me get the other window that's already running. All right, and we essentially we do a gulp serve. Let me Control C this so you can see what it looks like here for a moment. And we have to do a gulp serve no browser because essentially our local workbench does not work. So we have to explicitly tell it no browser. It'd be nice if it was smart enough to know that, hey, I can't render in the workbench, so just don't show it to me. But I have a feeling eventually they're going to make that work. All right.
Hey, Ralph.
Yes?
What happens if you try to run the serve command without the no browser switch thrown? Does it throw some kind of error?
No error. It'll actually show you your workbench, but there's nothing to add, nothing to work.
Oh, okay.
Just blank. Just nothing happens. All right. But what we have to do, we still need it anyway. The page is still needed. It's going to run the page. It's just going to be blank. There's nothing to do. You can't do anything on that page. It's not an error, at least. Here's the key. You see what it says here? Server started, localhost 4321, which was the page. What they're actually doing over here with Node is you're setting up your server, and this is actually an endpoint. An endpoint for, guess what? Your SharePoint Online to come and connect to. And let me go show you that over here. All right, so here's the concept. Here's your SharePoint Online. Oh, and here's another change. You remember we also had a workbench to use on this page here. Well, guess what? It's not a workbench that you would test these pieces on, but you would test it on a modern, and they very, very explicit, a modern SharePoint list. So this will, guess what? Not work with documents, because that's, guess what? A classic SharePoint list. If you create a new list from scratch, it'll create a modern one for you. And this is a case of a modern one. I created one for the CDN where I was doing the CDN pieces and putting it out there. So that's what we're looking at right over here. All right. So in order for us to debug it and work with it, and by the way, there's no deployment to the system at all, at least not just yet. For debugging, all you have to do is put in this huge monster crazy string at the end. And we're going to show you some samples of this in just a moment here. In this particular case, this is the app customizer that I'm running right over here. Let me break this string down. Let me see if I have my notepad over here.
I'm seeing what looks like an ID in that query string variable, or in that query string rather. Is that what you were referencing earlier?
Correct. And here it is. So let's take a look at that over here. I have my scratch right thing over here. See that ID? I copy pasted it right over here. And now I took their string, and it's very, very specific. I notice that I'm doing my local host. That's essentially where I'm getting it from. And then here's my custom actions. This is what it is. Manifest.js, custom actions. And then I have my ID right over here. And then I have over here, let's see, it's a little bit long to read. It's saying I'm using the particular extension called client-side extension application customizer. All right, and there's my property. Here's my text message, hello. And I basically, hello, bonjour, so you know I didn't do something like hello world. I just put something else in that particular property, right? Now, here's the thing. Take a look. For example, the field tester, the field name. It's different. It looks a bit different. It's manifest field customizers. And over here, this actually needs an array that actually needs the ID to be in it, as an example. So just so you know, when you're working with this, be sure that you are looking at specifically which kind of item you're doing and pick essentially the correct string that you're using for basically doing your debug. And if you don't do it exactly right, it's just not going to work. And it doesn't give you an error. It just simply, what's going on? I have no idea. Just dead. All right. One other tip. Tip. The name of your app. Don't make it long. 40 characters is what I'm hearing and I'm seeing as the particular limit for it. And it might have something to do with the URL the way that particular thing works. So I just use CSPUG, so that was easy, right? For example, 40 character, whatever you're doing, don't make that particular app name so huge. For whatever reason, that's not going to work. By the way, the app name is not mentioned anywhere in these strings, but it is probably going to be in the JSON somewhere.
Hey, Ralph, how did you know what the format, what the syntax of this load SPFX query string variable should be? Is that in the, is there an example in the documentation and the ideas that you copy the bits and pieces in?
So the closest we have over here is their article, their documentation, where they're showing you how to do a debug, and they're breaking down. Here we go. In this particular article, and it's all in the same place. All right, in this particular article, they're breaking it down. This is what load SPFX does. Here's what debug manifest file does. Here's what custom actions does. Here's the key, location, properties, and everything else. It essentially describes what that is. So you could sort of build it yourself, okay? And that's a little bit of a teaser over there, but you can build it yourself. That being said, eventually, from what I'm seeing, this is why it's still in non-GA mode. It looks like they're going to create a ways of making that a little bit safer and with helpers, so you don't have to memorize or have to keep copy-pasting monster strings. That somehow that's going to be more automated, and I'm looking forward to that when that happens. In the meantime, what's good about it not being automated now is you get to learn how that works. So eventually, when you do learn how to debug this stuff, this is why it's great to learn early. You get to understand the bits. So when something breaks because somebody built it, a custom thingy or version of it, you can fix it yourself. All right. Okay, so really quickly here, basically I copy paste that onto here, and then I'll show you what it does. So let's just pretend I went through all that copy pasting madness, and then I went over here and I hit enter.
And what you've essentially done is paste the equivalent of a magic spell onto the end of the URL for a typical SharePoint, or not a typical, but a modern SharePoint list. And by doing so, and by doing so, you've ended up enhancing or literally extending the capabilities of that list, hence the term extension.
Yes, so to speak. There's two things of it. Now, the extension, though, the only reason why I'm doing this is not because of the extension. The only reason I'm doing this is to be able to debug the extension. All right? Actually, the extension will work without any of that stuff in the back end. All that stuff in the back end, because can you imagine a user has to put that in all the time if they want to make use of an extension of the list? So obviously, if I deploy the extension and it's in and it's added to the site, it's going to work on the site. But how do I debug it? There's no way to debug it. So the whole concept is first what people are going to do before they actually deploy. And by the way, deployment hasn't changed. Deployment's the same. You deploy it as an app and everything else. You would add it to the page, which in this case, you would add it as an app right over here, and it would be part of the list. That'd be fine. All right, to the site, I should say. But you can't debug it unless you have that piece of string that's up there that's saying specifically where it's being debugged from. In this case, my local host. All right, and take a look. Because I did that, look at this, allow debug manifests. All right, so we have these choices. So I'm going to say load debug scripts because that's the only way I'll see this. There we go. Hello from the custom app optimizer. There it is. And that's all it is. That's all it's doing. Right there's my little render in action. Okay. And again, this is only for the debug. If I wanted to do something and I really didn't care to watch for it, that was okay. The big problem with the SharePoint framework model as far as debugging is that there was no real way to debug except if you put in your own things like this, your own hooks and handles. All right. If you created a SharePoint framework app and you deployed it, you might have remembered my demo from last time where I just simply showed it happening. There was no real debugging. If it failed, I had to go back and figure it out, or I had to put like crazy response righty type messages all over the place to see what was going on. In this particular case, this is an explicit debug handler. The SharePoint framework is going to eventually have one as well, but the big issue, of course, is like, well, you got the workbench, so why do you need a debug handler and vice versa? They're going to have to figure out how they're going to make the two work together at some point. But that's pretty much it. That's all there is to it. You say okay, and it's fine. It doesn't really do anything else beyond that. We can find examples for where you would use this stuff, but if you've done SharePoint customization before, you pretty much already know what you would like to use it from. The big deal, of course, is whatever you did before with Camel and everything else, there is no direct migration. There is no utility that's going to copy code and figure out what that code's going to look like in the new system. This is all brand new. No one has done it yet. Maybe Rencore might, or one of those guys, but not for a while.
So basically, any functionality that you achieved using Camel and all of the previous techniques,
yes,
you simply have to go into that feature set and find a way to recode it using the extension method that now is going to be part of the SharePoint framework.
Precisely. Now, here's the biggest thing, of course, about this is the fact that now anything on SharePoint now, unlike before with the Camel and everything else where you were sort of limited by the commands you give, basically anything is now pretty much accessible. All right. If it's it's client side, if it's an HTML element, you want to talk to it, you want to be to work with it, you want to find out how it works with SharePoint. And you recall, let's look at the code here just for just a moment. You'll see essentially when you bring in your properties and everything else like that, all the IntelliSense is going to help you try to put all those pieces together. You can now access that information without you having to guess what it is. Right? It's much quicker, and that's the whole point. It's all getting much simpler. It's getting much easier to use. However, as they say, the first step up is still the high step. Take that step up, and then it's pretty much smooth sailing from that point out.
So you're saying instead of having to know the object model and understand the syntax for getting a handle on all of the objects in that object model, what we get to do this way is use Visual Studio Code and its IntelliSense to very quickly see what the choices are of the objects, see what you got available. Once you find an object you want to gain access to, you can also use IntelliSense and the dot notation to get it to tell you what the properties are, what the values are, what the methods are, what the signatures are, instead of having to do all the original background documenting and investigating that we had to do in the past.
Precisely. So that's the whole point.
What do you think is going to be one of the first things people do with the extensions in their current incarnation, even though it's still in preview mode? Are they going to be making context pop-up menus on list items and continuing to augment lists that way, or are there some other things that got planned?
Okay, so a lot of it, firstly, and we're seeing this from the discussions in the Microsoft side, is a lot of it is the folks that have created the JS link type JavaScripts, the ones where you ever do an it's called add JS block is the command in old SharePoint 2013 and before, where you would essentially add a block that says run this JavaScript when the page loads in the site, right? And it did whatever. It could have, for example, do an audit. All right, or it could have like customized the banner to look cool or something like that, or brought in special special context sensitive type information that say, these are European sites, so they're going to get this color. These are Asian sites, they're going to get that color, whatever. As just a quick example of what that can do. So one of the first things people are doing is replacing those scripts right away. That's one of the first things that I'm seeing being done. The second thing they do is the field customizer is also the next popular thing. The next popular thing, mainly because that's what people usually want to do. They want to have a custom field. Have you ever tried making a custom field in regular SharePoint? You know, like say, like a calculated field, right? So you have two fields and you want to calculate the two. And it's like, how come I can never remember the syntax? Is it plus to concact two pieces of text? What if I wanted the number? What if I want today -7? How come that doesn't work every time? Is it today with a parentheses or not? You know, now imagine that you have the power of JavaScript and you can want to put a calendar control that's right out of like one of the better frameworks or anything else. You want to put a nice like a beautiful drop down that like essentially is see-through and doing all that kind of stuff that's out there. You want to mess with that field in a much better way, but you want to make sure that what was inherent to Microsoft, what made SharePoint remains. That's the second example that I'm seeing going out there. The third one, of course, is the right-click, do something else thing. That one is it's hard to say whether or not that's common or not. A lot of people are fine with what's there. I've been in situations where it's needed. So I have a document and I want to do something to it. Say I want to run a specialized workflow. All right.
Exactly.
If I want to run a workflow, I would have to click on the workflow menu and then select from a workflow. Well, what if I wanted to just run the workflow? directly. That would be the case of, I want that specific command ready to go. When you click that link, the workflow and everything else runs automatically, instead of the user having to go and select and then worry that they're not going to fat finger the selection and pick the wrong thing. Right?
Yeah, so that the focus is on, so the focus of that action is actually around the item and performing an operation on the item, instead of the focus being around the operation, and you start the operation and have to go find the item to operate on, which is far less intuitive.
Right, and now, mind you, notice that this is what SharePoint was all about, the lists, right? So they're essentially back to the roots. It's the list. The list is the king of the content in SharePoint. If you can't control that, or if you can't do stuff with that, then what's the point? the pun intended over here.
That is the core. The core is a website with a list in it, and what kind of lists can you make, and what kind of objects are on those lists, and what kind of solutions can you create, what kind of business problems can you solve. So it sounds like what you're saying is that the SharePoint framework extensions is actually opening up the door for other constructs that have been popular and available in pure JavaScript and other non-SharePoint technologies could conceivably be very easily dovetailed in to add to that user experience on the SharePoint side, which has been, for most people, it's been one of the common complaints of SharePoint. They get the list, they get the functionality, and they say, my God, it's ugly. Well, gosh, it doesn't look cool. It's not sexy. And this seems like it's opening up the door to be able to provide that sexiness, not by recreating it, but by literally getting the very same JavaScript that other people are using and being able to reuse it as a part of your SharePoint experience.
All right. And it's web skills that you take with you to get this done, as opposed to you have to be a specific SharePoint person to be able to figure that out. That's the whole idea behind here. Now, last time, I think we also talked about community sites as one of the things that they released with SharePoint. Now, the community site is essentially, now SharePoint is WordPress. When I look at what the community site can do, and then I look at this coding, I got WordPress covered completely. The only thing WordPress has that I don't have are all these like third parties that created all these beautiful themes and templates and everything else. It has essentially a bit of a market, but now if the market is just web stuff, then I can go to the other place to get the market stuff. It doesn't have to be in this. If PHP is what they were doing over here, now we're talking just JavaScript, straight up, right? React, Angular, you name it, you got it.
So now we're starting to see where the extensions are headed. It's a way of continuing to allow regular web developers access into SharePoint to start taking advantage of some of the user experience improvements that the other technologies have had for years, and start seeing them inside SharePoint. And like you said, and like we all saw in the virtual summit, the community sites are just, from a SharePoint standpoint, you say, wow, this is blowing my hair back. Everybody else that isn't SharePoint said, these have been around for 3 years. It's about time we all got into SharePoint. Gee whiz.
Yeah.
All right, fantastic.
That's the idea. That's it. If you wanna, let me give you the control back for just a second. And here you go.
All right, Ralph, thanks. I think we're back at, I gotta pick up my shared screen. You're gonna see me, everybody, kick into high gear, because the next thing that I'm going to talk about is a presentation on ITAR, and per usual, it ends up being a really big presentation that I have to try to find a way to squeeze into more. Hold on a moment while I get that one started. Looking for it and launching it now. I think I'm going to have to kill one presentation to get the other one started. Tell me when you can see this, everybody.
Looks good, Mark.
Everybody can see it? Great. Okay. The last couple of weeks, I was planning on doing a different presentation than today. But in the last couple of weeks, we've had a number of customers coming to us asking about ITAR compliance in SharePoint. It turns out that some deadlines have actually been handed over to people that are affected by ITAR, by these regulations, and it suddenly seemed more timely for me to build an entire presentation to get everybody who's a member up to speed on what ITAR is and why they might want to be concerned, and how SharePoint can actually dovetail in. That's what the next Actually, there's 33 slides, but we're going to go through them very quickly. That's typical for Mark. The rationale behind all of this is that the U.S. government initially, or the U.S. government views the sale, export, and retransfer of defense articles as part of safeguarding U.S. national security, which begs the question inside there, what are you talking about? What's a defense article? The big picture, to give you a little bit of background on all of this, what's all this about ITAR? What is it? It all starts with something called the Arms Export Control Act, actually from decades ago. It provides authority to control, to the president, to control the export of things called defense articles and services. From that comes something called ITAR, which is actually the regulations themselves that implement that authority. The president, once he got this authority to control the export of defense articles, he issued an executive order that basically handed it over and said, that's going to go to the Secretary of State. The Secretary of State is a part of the State Department. The State Department is also involved in the world of foreign policy issues and advising the president. They created what was called the DDTC, and the DDTC is actually what the entity that the commission that actually ensures the commercial exports of defense articles that they're consistent with U.S. national security objectives. In a nutshell, the DDTC then enforces the ITAR regulations, which implement the authority invested in the president to control the export of arms and arms-related information. Wow, there's a great big nutshell. There's the one big sentence. It all is interrelated. It's all a way to finally state what the rules are, who gets to enforce the rules, who has the authority to make stuff happen, and what actually is going to be happening. What's ITAR? It's actually all of the regulations governing the export of defense articles, and there's a URL for it. The DDTC is the Directorate of Defense Trade Controls. It's a part of the State Department. It ensures the commercial exports of defense articles and services are consistent with national security policies, and we've got a couple of URLs to them. A defense article is where all the lingo starts to get sticky. Inside the ITAR regulations, the International Trafficking in Arms Regulations, Section 120.3 states that a specific article or service may be designated a defense article if it meets the criteria of being on the U.S. munitions list. That's got to drive you crazy at that point. So something, a defense article, which is an item or even information, is considered to be a defense article only if it's on the munitions list, if it's somehow related to that. Now you're getting the hint that it's all about the munitions list. Let's look a little bit further into a defense article. Also in section 120.6 of the ITAR, it means any item or technical data that's related to the world of defense and shows up on this U.S. munitions list. So now we're all realizing that, hey, technical data, are you talking about content? Are you talking about documents, Mark? The answer is yes. In fact, it's any conversation that you have. It's a chat. Anytime information trains its hands and it has something to do with something on the U.S. munitions list, it actually is considered to be a defense article, and it needs to be controlled. Holy buckets. You can see how quickly this is actually going to start to get very sticky very fast. On the bottom of there, you'll see highlighted in yellow, technical data about even a single part of a larger structure that's related to defense actually ends up being ITAR compliant. My God, everything ends up happening. We've got a customer who builds ball bearings that go into tanks. Are they subject to ITAR compliance? Yes. Holy, you could just see how nearly everybody in America is going to somehow be affected by ITAR. Let's continue talking. Here's an ITAR excerpt again. Items designated for the purpose of export and temporary control constitute the U.S. munitions list. And what it's really made up of, I'll start using my mouse here. The munitions list is a list of all of the things that can leave the country as items or as information about those items that are going to be governed by the government. Category 1 through 5 is how they categorize them: firearms, guns and armament, ammunitions, launch vehicles, explosives, energetic materials, propellants, incendiary. The first thing that happens is you look and you say, wow, that seems pretty easy to say that we're not a part of it or we are a part of it. Just, hey, we either build guns or we don't, except for one little word, the term called part. Let's go see where that actually shows up. If we look deeper into section 121.1, we see section A, section 1 that says any end items followed by major systems and equipment, parts, or technical data are actually, if they're related to defense articles, then that technical data is also a defense article. And the big takeaway is, if you make even a single part of a larger defense article, you are actually subject to ITAR, to International Trafficking in Arms Regulation, about the item, the part, but also about all the information related to the part. And this is what's giving everybody the headache. Technical data for the purposes of the ITAR then means information other than software, which is required for the design, the development, the production, the manufacture, assembly, operation, repair. That's basically everything related to that item. If you wrote it down, it's information. If it's information, it's part of the defense article and it needs to be controlled. To start talking about control, we have to understand what they mean by violations, and the word export is actually what comes in here. Violations are actually rather scary. If you are exporting, possessing, or intending to export any information that's deemed a defense article, you are actually subject to potential ITAR violations. Without first obtaining the required license or written approval from the Directorate of Defense, it is unlawful to export or attempt to export any defense article, etc., etc. I won't go any further than that. We need to understand what you mean by the word export, because it has a very different meaning in the context of international trafficking in arms. If we dive into the word export, they actually define the term in section 120.17 of the ITAR regulations themselves. If you are in any manner releasing or otherwise transferring technical data to a foreign person in the United States, you have literally exported, and you need to be controlled. Now, when we look inside here, we see that the key word we need to understand here is the word foreign person. Let's dig in a little further. A foreign person is the opposite of a U.S. person. Let's tackle what a U.S. person means. A U.S. person means any lawful permanent resident or protected individual, meaning citizen by birth, citizen by naturalization, or permanent resident, but it also means any corporation, business association, partnership, society, trust, or any other organization that's incorporated to do business in the United States. In other words, in the world, everybody, there are two huge groups, U.S. persons and everybody else. And if you have something inside your organization, an item or information that is subject to ITAR regulations, you are not allowed to export any information at all to any entity unless they are a U.S. person. And even then, it's still governed, it's still controlled. But under no circumstances can you let a non-U.S. person, meaning a person or an entity, actually have access to that information. And this is the big deal, the big core of ITAR. Let's look at what a foreign person is. Not a lawful permanent resident, not a protected individual, and any foreign business or partnership, etc., that is not incorporated or organized to do business in the United States. It's us or it's them. And us is very clear. You're a U.S. person, meaning you're a native-born citizen or a naturalized citizen or a permanent resident as an individual, or you're an organization that is incorporated to do business in the United States. You're a known entity. Everybody else is off limits. You don't get to share any kind of information with them, and if you violate that, there are consequences. License actually has a specific meaning. It means a document bearing the word license issued by the DDTC that gives you the right to export information or the item itself to people on an approved list. And if they're not on the approved list, you don't get to export it. And if you don't have that license, you don't get to export it. You don't get to share information. Lots of terms here, and it's going to make your head swim. But let's keep going and see if we can start to understand this a little bit more. Violations, actually kind of scary. The things to note are that for each violation of various sections of ITAR, you can be fined up to $1 million. You can also end up being sanctioned. You can also end up having the Department of Justice consider criminal prosecution that can go all the way up to 10 years per violation. Scary stuff. That's your big takeaway. The deadlines. I got to mention this, why ITAR is getting attention. I have repeatedly come across mention of a deadline for ITAR compliance of 12/31/2017, a very rigid date. It's 6 months from now. I have seen people, lots of authors, vendors, even customers, increasingly concerned about that date. I have not yet been able to verify this deadline on any U.S. government website. I'm still going to keep trying. Consider the date real. Watch for any updates on that. But this is why everybody's suddenly worried. Paperwork, the kind of stuff that you need to care about. And again, we're leaning towards, hey, where does SharePoint fit in all of this? So I'm trying to give you all of the background so you start to understand where SharePoint can dovetail into all of this. There are various kinds of forms that you have to interact with. There are licenses and applications for licenses. There's registering. There are applications for licenses. There's various authorities to suffice to say there's a ton of forms that the government allows you to download, fill out, and submit to them through electronic entities. There are various tools that are available, and it's part of ITAR compliance is going through all of that paperwork and then keeping good track of that paperwork about your defense articles. Registration is one of those first tasks. If you end up finding out that you are ITAR compliant or that you are ITAR governed or controlled, the first thing you need to do is actually register yourself or your organization with the Directorate of Defense Trade Controls. The purpose is primarily a means to provide the U.S. government with necessary information on who's involved in certain manufacturing and exporting activities. Basically, the government needs to know that you're up to this stuff. It's not a bad thing. It's just the government wants to be in the know. Some of the tools that are available is something called the DTAS. These are all available on the DDTC website. You have access to all of these tools, and they've done a pretty good job because this is going to happen on a regular basis. You got an item, you decided it's ITAR controlled, you register your company, you want to be able to share information or the item itself with people on a list abroad, you have to apply for a license to be able to do that, to export that item or that information. They make it easy as can be to actually perform that. DTAS Online is one of those tools. That's what we need to know at this point. D-Trade is another electronic export licensing system. It's another part of their tools. That's all we need to know about that. After the first 22 slides, we've got 10 left. After the first 22 slides, your head is spinning, it's swimming around, and you're asking, where do you even begin? With so many terms, so many requirements, so many penalties, where do you even begin trying to achieve ITAR compliance? There is no game plan that's out there, no checklist. There's no actual certification, in fact, that anybody can offer. So where do you really start? The following going forward are purely opinions and recommendations by individual parties, me, but do not guarantee ITAR compliance in whole or in part, nor is MTech to be considered in any manner, way, shape, or part responsible for people or organizations using any of this information in whole or in part. That's just a caveat just to cover us. This is a scary area. Let's start talking about ITAR activities. The two big must-haves, everybody, is that you need to be controlling the export of defense articles, and you need to be maintaining records about everything that you're doing, the entire process. Those two things, controlling the actual export, the moving of information and items about things that are deemed defense articles, and then maintaining records along the way that if the government should ever want to ask you, what are you doing, you can very quickly and very visibly, very definitively demonstrate what it is that you're doing. Controlling the export is the first thing of defense articles. That really breaks down into, hey, you got to inventory all your items. You got to identify and vet out the things in your items that are truly defense articles per the U.S. munitions list. Ultimately, those defense articles, then you have to control all possible aspects of accessing that content that are deemed to be defense articles. And what that breaks down into, guys, is you need to be able to control access to the content itself. You need to be able to control access to the content hosting applications used to get at that content. You also need to be able to control the access to the content hosting infrastructure. That means where the content lays and has the content moved. That means the disks, the servers, the racks, the cabinets, the data centers, and even the networks. You need to be able to control the access. Once you achieve that control, you need to be able to monitor, audit, test, and document as evidence or proof of compliance that you are able to control all of this. That means if called upon, you need to be able to demonstrate that only key people, U.S. persons, have access to this information and any sharing mechanisms that exist for sharing that information. Once you've achieved that lockdown, once you've achieved that ability to control, then it just becomes a question of registering and registering annually as an organization that, yes, you do have stuff that is ITAR regulated. And there needs to be regular licensing of each type of defense articles. So you have a new item, you're going to apply for a new license. You get the license, you begin to export that information or that item, you do it for the next thing and the next thing. Those are the key items that are related to ITAR compliance. Let's look in a little bit more. Maintaining records is actually mostly all about CMS stuff. If we look at ITAR 122.5, and you'll see I'm actually citing the text itself, not summarizing, everybody that registers must maintain records. They must be stored in a manner that none of it can be altered once it's initially recorded without recording the changes who made them and when they were. What does that say? Audit. What does all this say? Hey guys, it says SharePoint. SharePoint can actually be used as a part of your solution. The stuff has to be handled for a period of 5 years. It has to be available at all times for inspection. That's what the government is actually looking for. They pop in and say, show us your records. You have to be able to produce them. It's a lot like Sarbanes-Oxley, the ITAR compliance. Controlling access, the core of ITAR compliance. We have to identify U.S. persons and foreign persons. We have to be able to vet out that those U.S. people are, in fact, U.S. persons, their citizenship, their permanent residency, etc. The best thing that we can do using SharePoint is to leverage group-based security control measures. We define security groups membered by only these U.S. persons. Then we worry about controlling access to the content itself using the security group approach, the security group method. If we take a look at SharePoint, which was the purpose of the first 25 slides, we ask ourselves the question, where can SharePoint, Microsoft Office 365, and even Azure, can they be a part of my ITAR, achieving ITAR compliance? Actually, there's a number of key parts. If we break up all of the individual features into these rows, and we look at SharePoint, Office 365 Gov, which is a product of Azure Gov Cloud, and then other, we see that all the blue check marks you see are where SharePoint or Office 365 or Azure can actually be a part, a very significant part of your ITAR compliance. As far as initially inventorying all your items, not much can be done there other than SharePoint. If it's all stored in SharePoint, you could help with the inventory. But really, that's a manual process that you're doing to try to understand what either fits or doesn't fit the criteria of the U.S. munitions list. Identifying and vetting the defense articles. Again, inventorying everything in your organization is not necessarily only SharePoint. Vetting out and deciding what things are defense articles is an iterative process, a filtering process, a selective process, kind of outside the scope of any one technology from SharePoint. But when it comes to controlling access to the content itself, SharePoint can actually fit very, very nicely, as can Office 365 Gov. It's still the same thing. It's SharePoint up in the cloud. Controlling access to content hosting applications, meaning SharePoint itself, can actually be controlled by SharePoint and the security group mechanisms that dovetail into Active Directory security groups and being able to apply security trimming on a group or on a site collection basis. Once we've got the content locked down, once we've got the applications controlled themselves, meaning SharePoint and even SQL Server, which give us access into the SharePoint environment, we're worried about the infrastructure. Office 365 Gov and Azure Gov Cloud, US Government Cloud, are two products that have been around for a couple of years now that have come very close to being perfected in the sense that they're completely ITAR compliant. They guarantee, Microsoft guarantees, that only US people can touch these products, that only US persons have access to these two environments. And we'll see a couple more slides shortly on that. So we see that SharePoint's a good play as far as infrastructure as well. Monitoring, auditing has always been a real strength of SharePoint as proof of compliance. We can show who touched what they did to it, both on the user level and now with SharePoint 2016, even on the administrative level. There are administrative audit logs that went out of their way to be able to provide this ITAR compliance. Registering is outside the scope of SharePoint, licensing outside the scope of SharePoint, but storing and managing all the registration and licensing and documentation also available inside SharePoint. Creating your own document vault, storing it, applying information rights management policies, etc. Applying lifespans to documentation and having it expire, things like that, all work out very nicely. We're hitting the home stretch and we're at 1 o'clock. If you guys give me 5 more minutes, we'll be able to wrap up. Controlling access to the infrastructure, US Gov Office 365 US Government is a new version. It's an isolated Office 365 environment. It's ITAR, FedRAMP, and even other compliant. It provides isolation, screen personnel completely on US soil. It provides access control, security, cameras, escorts for people, what are called second person escorts, and even in a secured cabling. So you can't even tamper with the cabling, moving the data back and forth. It's available to government entities, but more importantly, it's available to other entities that are impacted by ITAR, meaning if you're a non-government agency, but you're affected by ITAR, then you qualify to at least apply for Office 365, but it is subject to verification. They don't let everybody in. You are going to be vetted out as an organization by Microsoft, and if you meet their criteria, then you can become a customer of theirs. If that works for you to just use SharePoint and Office 365, great, but some organizations actually want to use Azure's government cloud. This is an isolated server network infrastructure government, also ITAR compliant, also available to government entities and other entities. But the two key points at the bottom differentiate this from Office 365. You are going to be responsible for the ITAR compliance of this infrastructure. You are going to put SharePoint on premises on there, and then you are going to be required to come up with a SharePoint administrative staff, a managed services, something like this, that are also ITAR compliant, a screened set of people. This takes a very unique consulting firm that offers that kind of managed service, or you need a very small staff of people inside your organization. This is something that MTech is actually exploring wanting to offer. If you are interested in this, by all means, feel free to talk to us. We're exploring all of this for some other customers as well. But the key point is, you can either go with Office 365 and Microsoft pre-controls all of the access to the infrastructure, or you can go with Azure Government, where you're getting the raw infrastructure. It's still ITAR compliant, but you have more control over what happens to the SharePoint that goes on it. But with that comes this greater burden that you have to also be the one that manages the SharePoint. You have to manage the SharePoint administration in an ITAR compliant fashion. Controlling access to the applications themselves, meaning SharePoint and SQL Server, you're going to use AD security groups. What we're recommending is AD security groups called US persons. It's a subset of your organization. They're fully vetted people. They're going to be used to populate your SharePoint side security groups. Another AD security group is US persons administrators. This is another subset of your admins that qualify as US people. And again, they're going to be the only ones that can lay hands on the SQL environment, on the SharePoint environment from an administrative level. And I think you're actually working pretty well to lock down your particular environment. Some other structures that are available inside SharePoint is leveraging the site collections and the security groups. You end up with site collections giving you logical isolation into separate content databases. This is actually going to be smiled upon by the government, saying that on a per item basis, you can lock out data and put it in its own site collection. So SharePoint does offer some really good functionality here, whether it's up in the cloud or whether it's on premise. Big summary for all of this is the last slide. Not all organizations are affected by ITAR, but many surprisingly are. Even content, even texting, even chats, even social media can be taken as defense articles. Export is a crucial term that cannot be taken lightly. Export means any and all forms of communicating, file transfers, emails, social media, conversations for that matter. If it's about something that's a defense article, actually needs to be controlled. Who knows how it's actually going to, finally play out. Communicating any ITAR controlled information must be controllable and must be controlled demonstratively. Each organization is responsible for compliance and licensing. Deadlines do exist. Penalties do exist. Compliance is an iterative process. You're going to take a first cut at it. You're going to refine, improve. The key components involve or include, but are not limited to, identifying and vetting what defense articles even exist in your organization, controlling the access to the content, the applications, and the infrastructure related to hosting or storing or sharing those defense articles, encrypting possibly or using information rights content, make documents self-destruct, things like that as needed is also a possibility. Monitoring, auditing, testing, and documenting is evidence proof of compliance, registering, licensing. Couple of big items at the very end. Neither the State Department or the DDTC, the ultimate empowered authority, actually recognize any sort of ITAR certification. So if you see people trying to peddle that, run away, because it doesn't exist. SharePoint technologies can provide critical pieces of an ITAR solution. If you do want more information, if your organization is looking at these solutions, feel free to reach out to MTech and contact me directly at Mark Boat. There are some references. Again, we'll share all of this information with the rest of the group up on the meetup site. It's yours for requesting. Let me jump back into the regular presentation, and then we'll be wrapping up in just a minute. Hold on one second. Where were we? We're talking about next session. Next session, look forward to seeing a lot of cool stuff. There's so many things that popped up in just the last couple of weeks and months that we haven't even been able to address in a monthly meeting. We almost need it to happen every 2 weeks. We got to talk about Microsoft communication sites. We'll see an overview and a demo. Microsoft Forms, Microsoft Stream, which I think is going to be an amazing technology. It's almost like they're competing with YouTube. Microsoft Teams, we're going to see our first overview and demo. Microsoft Planner, which is a planning technology that's part of Office 365, and ultimately Power Apps as an InfoPath form replacement. You'll see 6 items. We got 60 minutes. That'll give you an idea of what the next session, the July session, is going to look like. It's going to be crazy, but it's also going to be fun and informative. Not as in-depth as the past sessions, but we got to at least take a cut and then dive back in. That's the end of the session. Thanks, everybody, and see you at the July session. Any questions, any comments, any complaints? I haven't seen anything show up on the, I haven't seen anything on the chat. I'm only looking now. I don't see any questions. People are starting to dwindle off. I see that Jay finally came on. Jay, you're going to have to wait until next month to talk about your tips and tricks on content type and site column naming convention. I hope that works for everybody. That's it. This is Mark signing off. Thanks, everybody.